Hello everyone, welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Certification course. Everyone that's in the auditorium can be seated. Welcome all of you that are watching online from around the world. Thank you for joining us. Once again, if you can have your self-control units out and ready, we're going to be continuing on in Chapter 7 of the self-control unit. And if you remember, that's the third unit of a series of 5 for the junior high series in the Peaceful Solution. And if you haven't been able to go through the character and acceptance unit yet, and you're just now joining us or have joined us recently, it's really important, and all of these classes are online, to go back to the character unit and start there and go through the classes and then into the acceptance, and then of course you carry on into the self-control unit. And the reason being that everything we're going over tonight and everything we go over in the self-control unit, and then once we get to the respect unit, which will be shortly, all of those things are built upon what we've learned in the character and then the acceptance unit and moving forward, so to speak. So this is like trying to put the walls up on a house and you don't have the foundation without that character and acceptance unit. So please go ahead and go back and watch those. We've had a lot of people asking. They're all online, and you can go back and watch them there on our Facebook page, The Official Peaceful Solution. And you can watch those and come up to date with them, and that will make a lot more sense if you haven't been able to do so. Tonight, if you could go ahead and turn over in your books to LP 7C, Lesson Plan Page C, Lesson Plan 7, Page C. This is the last chapter of the self-control unit. And of course, we're talking about the environment, but we're talking about the environment in a much greater detail than what you see the Paris Climate Agreement, so to speak, where they talk about wood stoves destroying the atmosphere and vehicles destroying the atmosphere. The term fossil fuel, which is really an outdated term, and it's not really categorically correct, because the fuel itself doesn't come from fossils. It's actually created by the earth, and scientists are proving these things. And you know, these are things you need to take your students through and update your students with. And this information is pretty impressive, especially when you're changing textbooks. Textbooks written years ago said fossil fuels, and now they're changing them because they realize that these things are actually generated by the earth. The earth produces it. The earth can process these things. But looking over here, we're still in the second procedure, and we'll reread that second procedure because we're not completely finished with it. But tonight I hope to get into the third procedure. It says, tell students, once again, LP 7, page C, tell students that in the final lesson in this unit, they will explore some ways society polluted and contaminated the air, water, and food supply. So much more than that, and that's why we're adding more to it. It says, instruct students to read the sections entitled Introduction and Just What is Pollution, found on pages 187 through 188. Allow students time to complete the exercise on page 189. Then have students share their ideas with the classes. So turning back over to page 189, that's where we left off. And we had covered what is pollution. And of course, we talked about natural pollutants and man-made pollutants. And we discussed just how much detail is created with man-made pollutants and exactly what causes these pollutants to come into our environments. And of course, if you can go ahead and show the first slide, this is just a refresh in our mind. This is what people think of when they think of man-made pollutants. They think of trash. The water's gotten filthy because we've thrown trash into it. We're not keeping things clean. And then, of course, with the next slide, this is the man-made pollutant that people usually don't think about. COVID got the attention of people, but COVID is not the first disease that has been spread around, or virus. And COVID has been proven that it doesn't kill a person, but it will bring down a person's response in their immunity to the point where pre-existing conditions actually have been killing people. And you hear that a lot when you see that people have died from pre-existing conditions, and then COVID brings down the body to the point it can't deal with those conditions any longer, and it overtakes the body, then death sets in. But COVID got the attention, but we've had diseases for years that have been taking the life of people, from HIV to cancer to heart disease, kidney disease. I mean, we've got a plethora of contaminants that enter the body, the human body, that have been taking lives for years. And of course, they're always searching for that cure for cancer and, so to speak, other things, how to remedy the heart disease. But society has kind of messed off on the point that we probably need to figure out what we're doing that's causing this. What is the contaminant that's getting into our bodies? We talk about the earth as a whole, which is a very huge area to cover. Our bodies are very small. And if we can't figure out what goes on within, this area right here, we're probably not going to figure out what goes on in the earth itself, much less now we're trying to explore Mars and other planets and so on. But of course, when we see these viruses, that's just one part. But how are the viruses created? Well, the first image you've seen where the trash is in the water and then bacteria grows and then it gets into the body. We see a lot of here in the United States when people go swimming in stagnant water. You see it in the news quite often, these brain-eating amoebas, how they get into the body through the nostrils or in through the mouth, but usually in through the nostril and enter into the brain. And it's almost certain death. The death rate is in the 90 percentile range when these brain-eating amoebas get into the body. But of course, we want to talk about how to practice self-control in regards to the environment. And tonight we're also going to talk about how much society has changed. Remember, that's a group of people that's supposed to be living by a governing body of rules that keep everyone safe. It's when we get outside that governing body of rules that we start having disease and contaminants. And of course, the environment, which is much more than just the air that we breathe and the water we drink. It's also the communities in which we live. They become not so safe to the point that our bodies suffer. Well, here on page 189, it said the question of the day, and we read through this right before the class ended last class. It says, how do we practice self-control in regards to the environment? And of course, it said in the previous chapter, you learned that self-control is the ability to stop, think, and make choices that are moral and show value for life. And remember, page 6 of the character unit tells us that values are something that, we deem to be important. So we'll go out of our way to try to protect, keep safe. We cherish it. It's like when you get that new car or that new pair of shoes you've been wanting, you go home and you clean them every day. I remember the first new car I got, the paint job was horrible. It was falling off, but I still waxed it every day. Even though there was no paint on it, I was waxing pretty much metal, but that's what I had, and so that's what I did. And if I didn't have wax, I thought the hand cleaner my dad had in the garage, the Gojo, that would work. So I used that. And I lived on a dirt road, and it was dirty every day. And it probably wasn't worth $200, but to me it was worth everything. That's what I had. Well, we're talking about value for human life, though, and the things that help build up human life. Notice here it says the same concept applies to our environment as well. Everyone in our society, from leaders to policymakers to owners of factories and refineries to ordinary people, must take responsibility for preserving the environment because we are dependent on the earth for all of our needs. And remember, we also talked about how society is interdependent on each other. We talked about that in the character unit when discussing the ripple effect. How when one person makes a decision, it's like a pond that's dropped, or a stone that's dropped in a pond, and how those decisions, they ripple outwardly. Well, even in society, when someone decides to keep or not to keep a rule, that repercussion ripples outwardly into society. And you can take that and just very easily see if someone was to be negligent, they contract COVID, they go through the stores coughing, they don't really care. And this has taken place quite a few times. You've seen it in the news. Well, they spread their disease. And the same thing with monkeypox, where people have these open sores on their hands. They continue to go touching, especially babies. That's been in the news quite a few times, and it always links back to what's taking place where people not protecting themselves or not actually having respect for others and containing their own contaminants, so to speak. Here in the next paragraph, it says, in order to live, humans, animals, and plants need air, water, and food, and sunlight, and the only planet where these needs can be met is Earth. You're not going to be able to get in a jet and jet off to Venus or, Pluto. That's not going to save anybody. Well, in practicing self-control, we must stop and consider how the choices, and once again, we always underline that word choices, because that means we're in control. We're the ones controlling how and what takes place in our lives and the environment. And of course, if we neglect to be safe and make sound decisions using self-control, then we bring contaminants into our environment. Well, these choices that we make, as well as live our lives daily, affect our ability and the ability of other life forms to survive and function. So what we do affects not only ourselves, but also others. And looking over here to page 190, notice chew on this. I mean, that's something this is a fact in life that we need to deal with. We need to come to an agreement and understand this. It's up to us, the most intelligent species on the planet, to control the activities that pollute our environment. So once again, we're supposed to be the most intelligent species on the planet. And we're going to, through tonight's class, take a look back at how technology, which is supposed to make everything better, kind of has reversed this show of intelligence, this show of what makes common sense. Remember, we talked about it last class, to where if you were to talk to someone from the 1860s or 1870s or even the 1900s, where they would not even have a bathroom facility in their house, where we could tell them today and show them how, well, not only do we have one, we drink the water when we're done with it. I don't think they're going to look at us and go, that's a great idea. They would probably look and go, what, did the wells go dry? What occurred? Oh, well, not only did we start drinking it, we actually started putting it in bottles and selling it for a couple dollars a bottle. If you're not familiar, back in the 90s when the idea of selling bottled water was first introduced, it was considered one of the most ludicrous ideas in business. But there were some companies, Coca-Cola being the main one, that seen it through, and they have turned it into a billion-dollar business, and not that I want to show the name of this bottle of water here. I won't pick it up again and I don't want to promote or bring down companies. But when you get this bottled water and it says spring-fed water, and then you look at the back and it says from the Dallas Municipal City Water Supply, but there are some waters you can't get that are spring-fed waters. We checked it out to find out, but here in society, we don't really consider what we put into our bodies. We're all worried about what we're putting in the air, but we're not even concerned with what we're putting in our bodies. And our bodies, well, our minds that's what's making these decisions. And if we're not healthy, we're not going to make sound decisions. And that's what's supposed to be that keeps society going orderly, that we're all making proper decisions using self-control. Well, if the mind's not working right, the body doesn't care too much. Well, it's all about our attitude. And if you remember, that takes us all the way back to the beginning of how morality could be divided into three categories. And if we could show the next slide, of course, it's page 8 of the character unit. And you had that division line there between right and wrong. And of course, it was all about our attitude. And if you remember, right below that box there that says right and wrong, it says morality could be divided into three basic categories. And notice it was behavior and attitude toward all life, behavior and attitude toward possessions and property, and behavior and attitude toward the environment. It was the way we conduct ourselves and the attitude that we have concerning it. We can have a nonchalant, no-care attitude and live by the seat of our pants and have the, well, you only live once anyway, might as well enjoy it. Yeah, well, would you like to enjoy life being healthy for a certain amount of years, or just get sick right off the bat and be on medications and bedridden the rest of your life? This is a choice that we get to make. And then, of course, what are we leaving for those after us? Well, it's kind of like the debt ceiling in Congress right now in the Senate. Well, the next group that comes along, they can help pay for this 28 trillion, whatever we're at now. I don't even know what we're at anymore. We just need to enjoy life now, living in the moment. The generations after us, they can pay for it all. And you realize there's no real intentions to do that. But this attitude, looking over to the next slide, we covered attitude a lot. And this was page 14 of the character unit. And notice it said the positive side of character. And once again, it's page 14 of the character unit. And remember, it said your character is made up of many different qualities. They are called character traits. Character traits can be either positive or negative based upon your values, what you've been taught, your choices, and your experiences. The key to having moral character is to develop positive character traits. When you demonstrate these traits on a consistent basis, you will be known as a person of integrity. People who have moral character show by their actions and attitude that they care about themselves and others. So it's their actions and their attitude. It's, the way they're perceiving things, but also the way they're looking at things. Remember we covered what it's like to be a pessimist or an optimist. Do you actually look at the positive side of situations, or is it always the negative? Notice it told us to become familiar with these words that describe moral character traits and strive to develop them within ourselves. That's the attitude we're supposed to have, that we can get this done. No matter what life hands us, remember it tells us on page 11 of the acceptance unit that we can take lemons and make lemonade. Or as one of the teachers preferred, lemon meringue pie. You can do either one. I find it's easier as a man. Lemonade's a lot quicker, so that's what I stick with. But also the next slide, remember influences, and they're all around us. If we could go to the next slide. And it said that your values play such a key role in developing your character that you must be aware, notice you must be aware of how influences affect the things that are important to you. An influence is something or someone that has the ability to affect your attitude, way of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Once again, the attitude being a very important part to how we conduct ourselves and how we do things, and even how we perceive life in general around us, whether we really care about how the things we say and do affect our society or how we don't care. And we see in society to where the attitude of people, where they're locking down streets in California, so to speak. We've seen this also in Philadelphia. They shut down streets. They're having cars come out, spin out. They call it drifting. And then they're going in and flash mobbing, robbing stores. And the flash mobs go in 100, 150 at a time in stores that usually only have 5 or 10 people in them. And they go in and they just take control of the store, and they run it in and they run it over, and out they go. And we think that, that was sad, but at least nobody got hurt. If you've ever had to run a business, it's not easy running a business if 100 people come in and steal thousands of dollars worth of items off of your shelves. That's kind of hard to deal with, especially when, what are you going to do? You got to put more items back on the shelf. Well, who's going to pay for it? The honest customers that come in that actually pay for the merchandise, those are the ones that pay for it. So when you see someone stealing in a store, that doesn't mean you got to run up and tackle them. But it does help if you let someone know in a discreet way. You don't have to jump up and down and point to them and, flashlights and sirens going. But you're paying for that item that they're stealing, a small amount. And we've covered that, how 2 to 3 cents of every dollar that's spent at Walmart is spent to cover the items that are stolen. And when we see these things, of course, you can have the attitude that, it's not my problem. This store's got lots of money. This is Walmart. They'll cover the cost. No, they don't. You cover the cost. Walmart's not going to lose money, nor is Target, Lowe's, Home Depot. They're not going to lose money over someone stealing. You're going to pay. We're going to pay. So the attitude that we have and that common body of laws that govern society is what is important to keep our environment safe, clean, livable, and also enjoyable. Also looking over to the next slide, and once again, thinking about our attitude, because we're getting ready to cover tonight, it's all about our attitude. And this comes from page 88 of the character unit. And of course, that's where page 80 is where we covered about setting our mind in advance. We're preparing ourselves. The day is not going to always be perfect. It's not going to always go the way we want it to. So we have to set our minds in advance on how we're going to deal with the issues that arise in a positive way. And notice here it says, setting your mind and being prepared in advance to make the right choices will help to keep mistakes to a minimum and will keep you from regretful situations. Making mistakes does not mean giving up on maintaining positive character. On the contrary, making mistakes from time to time will occur as you grow up. And of course, we're talking about here with our character. You can be 80 years old or 60 years old or 30 years old, and you could still have the character or the attitude of a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old. We see that in society continually. We ourselves can find that within ourselves very easily. Well, with the right attitude, once again, the right attitude, you can use your mistakes to help you mature and maintain a moral character, but only if you learn from them and avoid making the same mistake twice. You know, it's kind of like when you hit your finger with a hammer. You don't look at it and go, well, let's try it again. See if it hurts the same way twice. You know, I had a brother that was telling me one time, he goes, I've learned you only make the mistake of cutting your finger off once. And I thought, I don't ever want to know that, but yep, you're right. You only make that mistake once. And, and he was very clear. You always think about it. Every time you pick up a saw, you always look at that finger that's gone. Now if we could do that as a society and we could look at things that are destroyed, where people suffer, things that bring down our communities, our environments, and we have to get it within our mind, the environment is so much more than the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, and the food that we eat. There's so much more that goes into those three basic categories that deal with the conduct of our life. And it gets into, as we talked about in the last class, and we showed these diseases, these viruses, these bacteria, even from E. coli, getting from contaminated water into the garden. Could you imagine someone not caring that the contaminated water is leaking over into the lettuce field? Well, what takes place? Everybody gets the lettuce. You start seeing on the 6 o'clock news that, oh no, there's an E. coli outbreak. You're not supposed to eat that bag of lettuce. That bag we ate yesterday? Yeah, usually by the time it gets to the news, it's like, well, my house, it's gone. We've already eaten it. You had to tell us like at the store. We didn't have time. But these are things that come out, and you'll see this with peanut butter, that, if it's got this date and you bought it 2 months ago, you need to throw it out. It's already gone. But in society, when people don't care, it truly affects people you've never met. Our non-caring attitude, not having a positive outlook for other people, not having compassion on other people, truly can destroy their lives. Imagine if you're the person in the field that knows the water's leaking, but you don't really care. They don't pay me enough to do this job. And if you're one of the people down where most of the lettuce that was contaminated that we've seen this last go around, once again, as I said, come out of Chihuahua, Mexico, when you're making $25, $30 a week, you tend not to care. It's going to people that make a lot more money than me, and they know where that food's going. So they're not too concerned with the effects that's taking place. But imagine if you could see from your decisions the family that just lost the grandmother or the mother or the father or the child due to the E. coli getting on the lettuce or getting contaminants into the food. And now that non-caring attitude, and I'm not blaming, the people in Chihuahua, Mexico in any which way, shape, or form. This takes place all around the world in many countries. But lives are lost, and that non-caring attitude actually costs the life of someone. Now a family is torn apart. Children are now one parent short, or a grandparent who sometimes is the only guardian someone has. That non-caring attitude over something that seems so small actually led to a life being lost. And looking over here to the next slide on page 127 of the character unit, and remember, it's all about our attitude. It says, you can always tell a positive leader from a negative one by the outcome of their actions, belief, and ideologies. Negative leaders lack integrity. They might be selfish, lack compassion, or respect for life. They usually consider only their own opinions or those who reflect their opinions. They don't exemplify to their followers the importance of achieving a positive moral character and the benefits of maintaining or attaining positive goals. In many instances, negative leadership has resulted in hatred, violence, and death. Positive leaders, on the other hand, are people of integrity. They maintain and demonstrate their positive moral character consistently through their beliefs, attitude, and action. Remember, that's one of the three basic categories of morality, is this attitude and belief toward others, and then it's shown through their conduct. They motivate others to also attain positive moral characters to strive toward excellence in all areas of their life. In addition to this, positive leaders will result in a ripple effect that will be advantageous not only to the individual, but to a society as a whole. And how does that ripple effect take place where it can save lives? once again, it's the attitude of the worker, and we can say anywhere. It can be in Florida where there's oranges, you know, in California where we get lettuce and spinach, which we have E. coli outbreaks in that also. One person caring that recognizes there's a problem, saying, wait, we got a problem here, we need to get somebody out here to test this, it could be sickening to someone, and that being done and saving people from getting sick, just through that caring attitude. But the non-caring attitude of, it'll go on, it'll work itself out, you eat enough, it'll kill it off. Everybody's got E. coli in their body anyway, which is true, but you know, too much E. coli in your body does not work. It makes you sick, and it can cause death. Well, just that basic decision making, and it sounds like I'm picking on the food industry, and I'm not intending that. You know, it can also be, just imagine someone working in a restaurant that has a cold or an infectious disease. And if they come to work and they're serving your food, coughing, hacking, spitting, whatever, and then they stick that food in your hand. Once again, we talked about how people get stomach viruses, you know, or cholera, which is very predominant in Africa and the Middle East, especially in Yemen. And in America, you know, you have something which is not, people don't really want to talk about, but if you get diarrhea in the United States, it's something you deal with, and you know, you can deal with it through a natural remedy. A lot of people like using yogurt, putting enzymes back in their stomach. Some people go the medical route. But in Africa or Yemen, it's a death sentence, because you're literally pushing water out of your body faster than you can take it in, and the water you're taking in is usually contaminated. So the more of the substance, which is water, that you need to keep the body hydrated, well, it's what gave you the sickness to begin with. So you're actually taking the thing that's supposed to remedy the problem, and you're making it worse with every glass. And if you could just imagine that something we get here in the United States, it's usually not a death sentence. In Africa, the last time I looked, it is the third leading cause of death. And that's a horrendous thing. But we tend to think here that, well, our water's safe. Well. That's where I get my water from, is a well. I believe it's safe, you know, when it comes from a well. I personally, you know, after being involved, I wanted to get to know. We took tours of the city water supply municipal system. And whenever the person that worked for the water supply company wouldn't drink it, that told me a lot. You know, and I can only say what he told us. And of course, this was a fairly large city that we went to, and they supplied water for 300,000. And of course, they're one of a few different municipal water supply places there in that city. But here, when you're talking about supplying water for large groups of people, you know, they've come up with some very creative ways. Even Bill Gates has gotten into where they say they can take complete sewage water, run it through a machine, and within 6 minutes, they say you have drinkable water. Now, me personally, I don't want to experiment with that. I would rather get it out of the ground. And we're going to talk about some more about that tonight, where it's all about the attitude, because, you know, out of the ground tends to be free. And it's not, I got a water bill where I was irrigating something here not long ago, and I figured I needed, you know, I use city water on it. And when you get a water bill that's $500, you know, all of a sudden it's like, just shut that stuff off. You know, I can't believe I just paid $500 for something I can get free out of the ground. But it's a business. Water is a business, and the chemicals they use in it and how to recycle the city water, it's a business. So look at Jackson, Mississippi. Look at Flint, Michigan. You know, look at what these people are going through. And this is the United States. This is not a third world country, but these are places where clean drinking water is not even available to them. You know, and you find people live in the countries that are drinking well water, you know, unless your well gets contaminated, you got pretty safe water, and that's what we find. But here on page 173, and this is in your self-control unit, because we want to get this into our mind with the attitudes and then what becomes of these attitudes when people aren't caring. So on the next slide here, page 173, or you can just turn over to page 173 of your self-control units, it says, when conflicts are not resolved, just like with individuals, nations, or opposing forces within nations can choose to declare war. War is the devastating result of a breakdown in positive communication. It is the strongest evidence that all peaceful means have been abandoned. War has many terrible consequences. One consequence is the tremendous loss of life and destruction of property. War only produces greater resentment, hatred, retaliation, and more war. War destroys the basic facilities and services that a country needs to function as a society. And then looking over to page 174, or the next slide for those of you that might not have a book, this is page 174, the character unit. And this is something else. It's a chew on this statement where we're supposed to have it in our mind and keep it there in the forefront of our mind. War is a sign of failure. It's plain and simple. War is not conducted to keep people safe. War is a sign of failure. The first thing that's broken before war are diplomatic ties. They shut down the embassies, they pull the ambassadors, the diplomatic ties are shut down, and then they go to a way of force to where they can kind of put enough pressure on another country to get them to surrender to the ideology that was first put onto the table. And of course, you hear countries say that, well, this is not in Russia's interest or America's interest or the Chinese interest. Well, why are all the interests not the same? The interest should be how to make society better for mankind. That should be the interest. But continuing on, once again, war is a sign of failure. Failure to practice self-control, failure to communicate respectively, failure to resolve conflicts peacefully, and failure to value human life. And when those things are put into society, the rules are out the door. And environmental catastrophes take place. And it doesn't have to be, like with the Exxon Valdez, the captain was drinking, too much, they ran shore, they hit something, oil went everywhere. That affected a part of Alaska, and it's been cleaned up since then, and they're not really seeing residual effects like you see from HIV, gonorrhea, syphilis, HPV, cancer, heart disease. But, here was a man that went to prison because he was drinking, his ship ran ashore, and oil went everywhere. Huge news back when the Exxon Valdez was ruptured. You never hear about the man that spread the HIV or the woman that spread the HIV, and it kept spreading and spreading and spreading, and it keeps going and going and going. You never really hear about that. But when you step back in society and you really want to, make a list of pros and cons, especially with your students. Well, what are people usually dying from the most? Smog? Wood-burning stoves? This is what the Paris Climate Agreement is putting out. We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on these ideologies, but why have we not reduced cancer? Why are children contracting HPV at the ages of 16 and 17 and having their part of their faces cut out, their tongues, from oral cancer? Get some of these pictures. I know schools are very limited to what you can show your students. Show them, take it to the max of what you can show them, or what the result of these choices are making. And tell them, this didn't come from the exhaust of a car, and there's no scientific study that says it does. There might be opinions, but there's no proof that says it does. But there is proof that these diseases destroy your body to the point they'll start cutting parts of your body off just to keep you alive. Well, what are the attitudes? What should the attitudes be? Well, here on page 191, it's all about our attitude. And remember, the three basic rules of morality is our attitude and belief concerning how we conduct ourselves. It says your attitude is the way you think and feel about something. To practice self-control regarding the environment, you must, once again, underline that word must, because that means it's important. It has to be there. It's a key ingredient for this to take place. You must have a caring attitude about the world around you. This means not taking the air you breathe, the food you eat, or the water you drink for granted. When you take something for granted, you assume that it will always be there for your use. The truth is, unless we care for our environment, clean air, water, and nutritious, healthy food might not always be there for our use. If you could show the next slide, we learned this with COVID. One side, you see the store shelves completely full. The other side, I would think that's what the store shelves look like around Tampa, Florida right now. They cleaned that store. I'm sure the stores were completely cleaned out because right now the hurricane is passing through that area of the United States. I was raised in North Carolina, and we went through hurricanes. And if you didn't go get food out of the store 2 or 3 days before the hurricane hit, you were not going to get food. These stores were completely empty. We also seen this with COVID. where we talked about you couldn't get Lysol, and for some reason, toilet paper became gold. Who knows why they bought so much? But you can't prepare for the things. You go to the store and it's like, where did it go? Well, think about when you go into a store and you think, well, it's always going to be there. Not necessarily. And then look at the next slide. Gasoline is something that a lot of people use. I dare say most of us are affected by gasoline. You see one side, $1.39, $1.54, $1.57. That seems like so long ago. Seems like it was. It seems like you're going back into the 80s, but it's not. That was actually just a few years ago in the United States. And then look at the gas prices over to the right, which they got up. This is recently, $8.75, $8.99, and $9.23. Those prices were out of California, which is the highest gas price, which has a lot of tax, but it's also the gas price. And then imagine if you're someone that's living in minimum wage, on minimum wage, and you're budgeted for $1.39 gas, what do you do when it goes to $8.75? It's not like you just, I just use my credit card, I guess. Well, your credit card's going to max out pretty fast. When you're working all week, and imagine this, working all week just to pay for a tank of gas to get to work, where do you eat? And everybody's got to have a cell phone, right? Cell phone's more important than oxygen. You got to have that. And you can go through basic budgets with people. And I was just talking to someone from Medellin, Colombia, right before class. And they were telling me they went to pay their taxes, and it was 386,000 peso. And I said, man, numbers that big, American minds cannot compute numbers like that. You got too many zeros after that. They converted it down, and it was 213 US dollars. And I thought, well, that's not much. And they sent back, that's a month's salary for me. $213. Imagine, and you think about Americans gripe, I didn't make $15 an hour. There's a lot of people. Now, I want you to imagine people living in a country, and this is just one country, where they make $50 to $60 a week. There is no government assistance. There's no food program where you get food. They don't help pay for your living. When you get sick, there's no medical benefits. There's nowhere to go because you work, you get free meals. None of that's being offered. You get $50 to $60 a week, and you got to survive. And if you get married, now you got $100 because your husband's making money too. And then you have children. You still got, you need a place to stay. How are you going to get around? You got to go to work. And you start realizing, here in America, we're pretty spoiled. And we gripe when the price of something simple goes up. Well, our environment could be our community, could be our state, could be our country. But you know what? There's other countries out there, and their lives are just as valuable. And here in the United States, we always want things cheap so we can have more money to buy more useless things, right? But we always demand that they're cheap. That's the American way. But when you're getting products that are dirt cheap, the people that made them were paid almost nothing to make them. If you ever see, the shirts that you get, I used to have a business that dealt with screen printing of shirts. And a lot of them come from Colombia, other areas in South or Central America. And I always liked it because wholesale, the shirts were like $1.03, $1.04. And they were quality shirts that in America, they sold for $10 and $12. Until I started talking to people from the factories that actually made the shirts and realized they make like $4 a day. It didn't become so impressive to me after that point. Especially when you realize that they live in societies that you make it or you don't make it. That's the only way it goes. Why is theft so high in countries like that? You try to make it on $50 a week and no one helps you. What are you going to do when your child's screaming for food? What are you going to do when you need something? You see something on the side of the street, what do? They take it and they sell it. And how much do you get for it? Well, I don't care. I stole it. So if I get $5, that's more than I had. When you look at the U.S. dollar, $1 US, and to equal that takes 4,132 Colombian peso. $4,132 to make $1 US. And I asked them, I said, what does a breakfast cost there? And I don't know what a breakfast was. I didn't ask the detail, but they said usually anywhere from 15 to 20,000 peso. Could you imagine paying 20,000 peso for a breakfast? Now, that's the society that we live in. That's the environment we've created on a global scale, to where here we want things cheap and we want money, but we want things cheap. Well, that requires other people being paid next to nothing to do something. And very few societies or communities are worried about the citizens enough to where they make sure they have food, clothing, and shelter. That's almost non-existent, places that actually do that. But a society that does that, that's a society that's practicing positive moral character. And it's not where I give you this, but I already expect something back before you do it. No, it's a society that cares. We don't see that in today's society. It's always a push and grab. The healthy food, well, we'll keep that, send the unhealthy stuff out somewhere else. And then, here we're dumping tons and tons of grain and rice in the ocean when we have people we say need it, but we're still dumping it. It doesn't make sense, does it? Well, once again, it's about the attitudes, and it starts with leaders first. Continuing on here on page 191, it says, when was the last time you stopped and thought about the fact that you're connected to the earth and it to you? All life forms affect the earth in one way or another. The interconnectedness can be easily overlooked as you go about your daily routines. In other words, we're not thinking about it. Once again, COVID kind of brought us up to date about the things you touch your face, and how everybody you interact with. But we tend to forget the stomach viruses that we get, the common cold that we get. That's all transmitted from one person to the next. For example, you don't normally think about the air you breathe because breathing is automatic. Nor do many people consider the quality of water and food they ingest unless they live in an area that has been affected by drought, which is where we're at, or they eat something that causes them to become sick. So that's the attitude of people that I'm not worried about it until it affects me. As long as it's not affecting me, what do I care? That's kind of the attitude that society has of what's going on in the Middle East, or what's going on around Ukraine and Russia, what's going on in Africa with Somalia, around the Horn of Africa, or even into Uganda and other locations, to where it's not affecting me. What do I care? I've always said that if you don't care, get to know someone there. Talk to someone that's actually living it. And if you can talk to someone, if you can hear the misery they go through and still not care, then you realize you are a part that's destroying society. There's no other way it can be looked at. But I think that most people, we will whitewash our minds, and as long as it's not affecting us, we don't care. Just like the hurricane coming through Florida right now. Most of us not really concerned about it unless lumber prices go up because the plywood is going to be used down there, and that's when we care. It was the same way with COVID and how things occur with COVID. Many people didn't care that it was affecting people as long as it didn't affect them. I know many people it didn't affect, and they cared a lot about who it was affecting. And they tried to send out alarms and tried to help people. But it didn't affect them, but they still cared about everyone else that it did affect. Well, once again, that comes from positive leadership, and that comes from attitudes that have been taught how to be directed toward positive character. But we're missing that in society. Where does that start with? It starts with leadership. And I'm not speaking against the latest, greatest president of the United States. I'm not speaking against the president of Russia or the president of China or Somalia, Uganda, or Yemen. It's leadership in general and the attitude of what conducts itself. We just had our leaders gather at the UN, and all they talked about was war. They always come and talk about problems, but no one brings answers. I would challenge them. The Peaceful Solution has offered answers for many, many years. And as the author of the Peaceful Solution offered one time to the country of Egypt, give 3 months and see what change you can make. You can make a change if you implement positive character education into the environment. The attitude of the people will change. But of course, people don't look at it that way, and it becomes too hard to believe. But continuing here on page 191, it says, don't wait until you're adversely affected by contaminants in the environment to take notice of your food, water, or air supply. Develop a caring attitude about the environment because the quality of your life is affected by the world around you. Don't wait. The most horrible thing I think a person can go through is, I don't care what takes place in life as long as it doesn't affect me. And they have that non-caring attitude. They work in areas that they know can damage their bodies, and then they have a child, and the child is born with defectiveness and it's suffering. And once again, I don't know how much some teachers are allowed to show. I know some teachers have a very wide kind of field they can show, and some are very narrowed. But if you've never seen a child born with its heart on the outside of its body, or a child that's born with huge defects to the face, the cleft palate didn't form properly, or a child that's born with the legs bend the wrong way, or they don't bend at all, or an individual that's born and the arms didn't mature properly, you know, there's reasons for that. It's not bad luck, as society says. There's reasons, there's causes for that. And once again, we should care before it takes place with us or our families. We should care before we ever see the negative side of choices. And that's what the Peaceful Solution is offering. Well, food for thought. Stop and think about what you're putting into your body and how you're treating it, because it's the only body you're going to get, you know. And a lot of people think, that's all right, I'll go to the doctor when it's over. I sure hope you've made a lot of money in your life to go to the doctor, because it's going to be expensive. It's not a cheap thing. And people that have had diseases where they go for treatments, they see that, you know, you don't exactly beat the illness, but you are broke by the time it's over with. So you're both mentally, physically, and financially stressed by the end of it. Well, going over to page 192, we want to try to get through part of this. That way we can leave William a great place to start, because this is a great part of the Peaceful Solution to look at. And it says, eventually things change. The question is, do we allow it to change for the better or for the worse? Once again, you know, think about that person that you're talking to, that you're trying to convince them, yeah, drinking the water that I just deposited here, yeah, that's great. They're going to look at you like you're crazy. You know, that's what technology taught you, was that? Well, how many things have changed? Notice it says here, with our modern society and all of its conveniences, it's easy to assume that there will always be an abundance of supplies and resources at our disposal. We're learning that's not true. Many of the conveniences that we have grown accustomed to are relatively new. Talk to your grandparents or great-grandparents and ask them, what was the world like when they were your age? You might be surprised to learn that they grew up without many of the things that you take for granted. The world we live in has changed a great deal within the last century. That's just the last 100 years. Can you imagine living in a time where there were no grocery stores or malls to go get things you use on a daily basis? In fact, not only did we not have grocery stores, we did not have electricity, personal computers, cars, planes, and many other countless conveniences we have grown accustomed to. Just to show how things have changed, when this book was written and came out in 2005, not everybody had a cell phone. Internet was not a huge thing back then, so it's not even kind of tied into this very much. But now, as we've told you before, we went in as teachers into schools and taught, I think it was the first graders we were teaching that time. I know myself, William, and Catan, and David were there teaching. And these were, I think it was either first or second graders. And we just decided, how many of you guys have a cell phone? Out of 34 students, 32 had a cell phone. And they were all at school with them. And I think it was right around half of them had unlimited internet. It had no parental controls or anything on it. That's second grade. You know, I'm thinking, wow, you guys, you know, you've got like poison in your hand. But let's take a look at some slides and see how much life has changed. You know, here you see covered wagon, horse-drawn carriage, so to speak. That was the way of getting around. And I want you to notice not just the way they traveled, but back when people traveled, look at even their dress. You would think, oh, they're dressed up for the picture. When people traveled back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and even American Airlines has a thing where they show when people used to travel the United States, when they flew, that was a special occasion. You dressed up for it. Now, obviously, these people, they wasn't going across the Badlands of Wyoming, but they got dressed up, and look how, you know, they're surviving. They're not griping, complaining, throwing things, But now look over to society here on the right-hand side, and of course that's California. I dare say the people that will rear the covered wagon are probably more joyful than the people stuck in traffic right now. But life has become a hurry up and get to nowhere society. And then, of course, look over to the next slide. And there you have a number 2 wash tub with a washboard. And, of course, there's what they would call back then the housewife. Well, why was she a housewife? Because it was a full-time job. There was no soap operas to sit at home and watch. These women worked hard, very hard. Imagine washing your clothes like that. And I'm very guilty of it when I'll go home. I'm like, man, I got to go home. I got to wash 2 loads of clothes. All you literally do is throw them in the washing machine and then, come back an hour later and throw them in the dryer. We make it sound like we're using washboards. But this was society just 100 years ago. And in many places in the United States, this still takes place. Washboards are still doing this. You can go to the Amish and see it. But I've been to other countries and I've seen this taking place, where they don't really have washing machines. This is the way they're washing their clothes. So this is not something that has changed drastically, but you look over to the right-hand side, it's become a big business. If you don't have it in your home, well, there's a laundromat on every corner almost. And this is something that's just been readily accepted. And then over to the next slide, you see here a kerosene lantern. That's what they used to use to read a book, and that was very important. Well, in today's society, the houses are designed to where you don't light just up the inside, you light up the whole outside too. That's the decor these days. But just 100 years ago, they were glad just to have a lantern to read a book on the inside of the house. And today, we spend an enormous amount of money to light up everything where we're not even at, just so it looks nice. It gets attention. And then here to the next slide. And if you've never seen something like this, these are all outside lights. And of course, this is a plane taking off from a city. And these pictures do not do justification. I remember when we were in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and our flight left out at 11:55 at night so we could get back to Dallas, Texas early in the morning because it's like a 10-hour flight. When we left Buenos Aires, Argentina, and of course it's midnight, the lights and the size of the city was just enormous, and it was a breathtaking view. And then we went down to Jamaica, and we were overlooking Kingston from a place called Blue Mountain. And we were way up in the mountain and looking down at all of these lights that were it was just a magnificent sight. And these cities are considered to be poor, but they still had an enormous amount of light and the infrastructure it took to generate that light. And these are considered, Buenos Aires, Argentina, it's a huge city, but the majority is very, very poor. And so is Kingston, Jamaica. In Kingston, Jamaica, I remember when we went there, the US dollar, if you traded it in, you got 265 Jamaican dollars. And that's what life was like. We came out of the stores and they were throwing the coins on the ground because they were worthless. But think of not just the lights you see, but look at the infrastructure and all of the things that go behind generating those lights that are just lighting up the outside. Not the inside of houses, this is just the outside. And you would think there's more lights on the inside than the outside. And then, of course, going to the next slide, you have the infamous outhouse that they used back in the 1800s. And then here you have, this would be considered a modest bathroom in today's houses. It's very narrow and, it's not as extravagant as many. But the outhouse, most people today would not dare want to use an outhouse. But when you look and research how outhouses were used and how it worked with the soil and how the microbes broke down that waste and actually, it all went together and everything went well. The outhouse isn't preferable. But if you talk to that guy from the 1860s and you say, I know you had to do that right there, but here, look how pretty it is. And you can drink the water, I'm telling you. Not all things that glimmer, that's shiny and glamorous is gold. But think about how technology has increased. And of course, with technology has come great destruction. And looking back here to page 192, it says, just a century ago, this is right above the horse-drawn carriage there, just a century ago, most people lit their homes with candles, or lamps and heated their homes with wood or coal. Electricity was only for the very wealthy. Transportation consisted of horses and buggies. You know, for your students, and I'm not trying to endorse certain programs, but if you've ever not had the opportunity to watch, it's a program called The Men That Built America. And it deals with Nikola Tesla and, of course, Thomas Edison. A lot of education there showing how only the rich had certain things. And it's very educational. We took all of our students through it so they could see it, because it's really helpful to see how you had to be not just wealthy, but very wealthy to have electricity. It was not something your common folk got. And there was a battle between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison over this business of creating electricity. But back here to page 192, it says electricity was for the very wealthy. Transportation consisted of horse and buggy. There was no indoor plumbing or toilets that flushed. Instead, there were outhouses, as we've seen in the picture. And in many areas, open sewers and garbage heaps breeding flies and disease. Imagine if you had to wash all of your clothes by hand and hang them out on a line to dry, or bring buckets of water in and heat it on your wood stove to take a bath. People worked very hard as recently as several decades ago just to complete their daily task. You know, these things weren't readily at hand. It says, with modern technology, we have advanced by leaps and bounds. For instance, the refrigerator, washer and dryer, as well as indoor plumbing and hot water, are all ways that technology have simplified our lives and made our daily routines far more pleasant. Doesn't mean we're using them in the best way, but it has made it more pleasant. Freeing up time for other activities. It's usually not work either. With the industrial revolution came factories and produced a variety of supplies for consumers. The invention of cars and planes made transportation quicker and more efficient. But along with the benefits came the consequences generated by electricity to run our lights, and electrical appliances produce waste. I want to close this class with a video. And this took place in Beirut. And this was a chemical facility in Beirut. It was huge in the news when it took place. But the effects of what takes place when you gather chemicals and you don't know what to do with them, so they were just storing them. And they stored them, and they stored them, and they stored them for years. Well, this is the end result that occurred one day in just a matter of minutes. So think about this. Stored chemicals, and this can be the result when you have nowhere to put them. If we could go ahead and play the video.
Extraordinary images tonight of deadly explosions felt by millions in Lebanon. Blasts that shook a city and injured thousands. This was the first, coming just after 6 in the evening at Beirut's main port, sending up a plume of thick smoke. Beneath it, fires raging and flashes of light, filmed by nearby residents. None of them could have guessed what would happen next. A second massive explosion that some described as like an earthquake. A mushroom cloud of debris and seawater blasted into the air. The detonation was heard 200 miles away in at least 2 other countries.
I saw something flash and I couldn't hear anymore. It was raining glass all over the city of Beirut.
On the ground, dozens lay dead. Lebanon's health minister says almost 3,000 people have been injured. The port area destroyed. But what caused it? Officials tonight say a warehouse has for years been filled with dangerous explosive chemicals. Warnings about the dangers, they say, ignored. Beirut, so often a battleground in war, resembling a war zone tonight.
Now, I'm not for sure how much toxins that put into the air, but I would dare say it was more than a couple cars. But you see with these chemicals we produce how they can affect society and families in general. A lot of people died in that. A lot of people suffered. Homes were lost, jobs were lost. You know, the city was shut down. We're going to stop right here on page 192 because I know William's going to have a lot more to bring with this increase in technology and how decision-making and the lack of education in how we conduct ourselves is affecting us as a whole. And we cannot stress enough as we go through this that you get into the minds of your students. It is so much more than air, water, and just the basic trees you see. It goes all the way down to the microscopic level of virus, bacteria, disease. All of these things play a huge part in breaking down our environment. And once again, as we learn in the character unit, a society that's positive lives by a common body of rules. And when those rules are implemented and put forth to work in a society, everyone benefits and the reduction of this contamination is reduced drastically. Thank you for joining us. Once again, our next class will be this coming Sunday, 10-2 at 5:30, and our teacher will be William. Thank you once again for joining us.